The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Alliance's annual federal budget briefing. My name is Julie Klein, and I'm the Policy and Outreach Coordinator at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'll be joined today by other Alliance staff, including Steve Berg, Vice President for Programs and Policy, Noelle Porter, Program and Policy Analyst, and Jared Thompson, Program Associate at the Alliance. In this webinar, we're going to talk about the President's Fiscal Year, commonly abbreviated FY 2018 budget request, which, as many of you likely know, was released on Tuesday. Before we delve into the content of what was in the budget, though, I just want to note that you can find a number of helpful materials, including an FY 2018 budget chart and budget rundown on the Funding for Homelessness Programs page using the link at the bottom of the current slide. And then you can also use the tabs at the top of that page to visit our Take Action page, Take Advocacy Actions. You can alternatively find the budget chart and the budget rundown in the handout section of this webinar software on the right side of your screen. And if you would like to receive updates after this webinar, we will be sure to send further information on that also, and we'll get into that later. Next slide, please. Please also note that during this webinar, all of the lines are going to be muted, but if you do have any questions at any point, you can send them to us through the webinar software. To do so, you'll see a box labeled questions in the webinar panel at the right side of your screen that you can type your questions into, and we'll go over them at the end. And if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, I would recommend calling in by phone instead of using your computer speakers. And if you have any additional issues, please just quit and restart the webinar. All right. So the purpose of today's briefing is to learn what's in the President's new budget proposal, how it impacts people experiencing and at risk of experiencing homelessness, and how this impacts our work together to advance key issues this year. Steve is going to start things off by providing a brief overview of the federal budget and appropriations process. He'll then discuss what we think of this budget overall and the budget outlook moving forward. Next, Noelle and Steve will review the Alliance's top 3 policy pieces of the President's budget proposal and what is included in the proposal for each. Then I will explain how you can get involved in advocacy around these top 3 issues impacting the federal budget and impact the federal budget process this year through our FY 2018 homelessness funding campaign. And then finally, my colleague Jared will lead a Q&A session where we'll go through and answer as many of your questions as we can. And remember, you can submit those in the questions section of the box on the right-hand side of your screen. And as a reminder, though this webinar will focus on the Alliance's top 3 priorities instead as full of a rundown of the programs that impact homelessness as we've done in the past, the Alliance's policy team has compiled a really helpful discretionary budget chart and a budget rundown document that includes a large list of discretionary programs and key mandatory programs that provide a thorough overview of what's in the budget for these programs, and that rundown also indicates which programs of the budget would be the budget would completely eliminate. So do be sure to check out those materials in the handout section of the webinar or on our homelessness funding page. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Steve Berg for a refresher on the budget and appropriations process and overview of what's in the budget.
All right, thanks, Julie. And first of all, let me start by thanking everybody who's on this call. We have over 200 people on again. We know every year that the people who join this budget call are the people who are going to be with us throughout the year, trying to make a difference in what Congress does with these funding accounts. And we appreciate it and could not be nearly as effective without all of you. So thanks for joining. All right, the Trump budget. People have been reading about this, maybe extensively, if you're like us at the Alliance, staying up late, fiending over it. So let me say a couple of things. Obviously, on broad issues of policy relating to not just to homelessness, but to poverty and anti-poverty programs in general, this budget proposal is sort of spectacularly bad. It's also more than at any time that I've been doing this, dead on arrival on Capitol Hill. I mean, everybody says, every year when the president submits a budget, the people from the other party always say, oh, that budget's dead on arrival. This year we've got leaders in the president's own party saying it's dead on arrival, and I think that's exactly right. It's important to look at this budget because a budget is a statement of priorities and a statement of values, and I think in this budget we are seeing the values of the people in the administration that have captured the budget-making process at the White House level. And although Congress is not going to enact this budget or anything like it this year, that is what we're up against in as long as those people are in those jobs. So we need to start right now working on how we talk about these things, how we relate to the public about these things, and get ready for a multi-year battle. So what we need to be about for this year, though, I think, given the sort of bad reception of this budget on the Hill, is not so much about the Trump budget or about what's bad about the Trump budget, but about what Congress does need to do. Congress needs to provide a budget that includes funding to keep making progress on ending homelessness. That's our goal. Obviously, the Trump budget doesn't meet that criteria, but there's a lot of other things that aren't as bad as the Trump budget that still wouldn't meet that goal. So what we need to be about is what Congress does need to do. Today, in this webinar, we'll review the Trump budget probably because in our human weakness, we are not capable of not talking about it. But I think to a much greater extent, and not only today, but throughout the coming weeks and throughout the year, we're going to focus on what we need Congress to do, what opportunities exist to improve funding, where the greatest danger of losing important funding is, and where our voices as people who are working on ending homelessness in our communities, where our voices can make the biggest difference. So with all that being said, let me start with a quick review of how Congress makes a budget, because I think this is important to have a basic understanding of. The first thing is, no, back to the one before. Sorry, talking to the person who's got the slides there. The first thing is there's two broad categories of spending that Congress deals with. It's called mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Now, mandatory sounds like, oh, the government's got to do this, and discretionary sounds like, well, maybe they don't have to do this. That's not how these should be interpreted. These are technical terms involving the Appropriations Committee's role in the process. Mandatory spending programs, the Appropriations Committee has to include the amount of money provided by law for those programs. Discretionary spending, on the other hand, the Appropriations Committee has within its discretion spending whatever they think is appropriate for those programs. Most of the programs we're dealing with are discretionary spending programs. Basically, all of HUD is discretionary spending. VA medical services, including all the veterans homelessness programs, are discretionary spending. The targeted homeless programs at the Labor Department and HHS and the Education Department are all discretionary programs. And that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. We'll touch on mandatory when we talk about Medicaid, but mostly this, I want to describe the budget process for discretionary spending. Okay, now to the next slide. The first step in doing a discretionary spending budget is setting an overall cap on discretionary spending for the year. And that's done through what's called a budget resolution. The Congressional Budget Committee will prepare that. The House and Senate will vote on it. And one of the things that's in the budget resolution will be a cap on discretionary spending. Now, this year, what will be in there will be the cap that was in the 2011 Budget Control Act. Some years in the past, the Budget Committee sort of made up the budget cap based on its own thinking. But this year, that's set out in law. For the last 4 years, we've had temporary budget agreements that have raised the caps that were set in 2011. But the last one of those expired at the end of 2017, or at the end of the 2017 process, and now we're back to the original Budget Control Act. You've heard the term sequestration used to describe those caps, and you'll continue to hear that this year we're back to sequestration levels. And the sequestration level for non-defense spending is a tiny increase, like about a $3 billion increase, which in the context of the whole federal budget is tiny, over 2017, and it's wildly insufficient to cover increased costs. We have increased costs in HUD programs because of rising rents. VA medical services are all discretionary programs. We have quickly rising costs there due to more veterans and the Vietnam era veterans becoming older and needing more health care. So that the Budget Control Act leaves the Appropriations Committee in a very bad situation, both on the defense side and the non-defense side. So there's a lot of concern in Congress that the return of sequestration is going to be a very difficult thing to deal with. The Trump budget, by the way, deals with that by leaving the overall caps from the Budget Control Act in place, but raising the defense cap substantially and paying for that by lowering the non-defense cap even more substantially. And that's why for programs like HUD's programs, the Trump budget has such a difficult time doing anything realistic. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what does seem possible to happen is another budget deal, so that rather than dealing with the sequestration level caps in the original Budget Control Act, Congress will make an agreement to raise those caps again, like they did for the last 2 years, like they did for the 2 years before that. That would likely be an agreement to raise both the defense and the non-defense caps. If that happens, even though many members of Congress are talking about doing this already, it's probably not likely that it will happen until later in the year. The Appropriations Committee will probably write appropriations bills based on the sequestration caps that will be very bad. They'll bring them to the House and Senate floor and see if they can pass them. If they can't get enough votes to pass them, then they'll have to go back and try something else, and what that something else will probably be will be a short-term budget deal to raise the caps again. This is exactly what happened 2 years ago. The last time they were trying to do appropriations using the sequestration level caps. Our goal throughout that whole process is to be very vocal about what we need, and if what we need can't be accommodated through the sequestration caps, then we need to raise the caps. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's setting the overall spending cap. Now you see here, this is a chart showing the whole process. Starts with the President's budget proposal, the budget resolution, which I just talked about how that might come about. Then the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, the full committee chair, divides up the money between the different subcommittees. So that person gets a total amount of discretionary spending through the budget resolution, and they decide how much of that each subcommittee is going to get. People familiar with this process know there's different subcommittees. There's one for transportation and HUD, where all the HUD programs are. There's a labor, HHS, and education subcommittee, where all those programs go. There's a military construction VA subcommittee that deals with Veterans Affairs spending, and a number of others. Those subcommittees take their amounts, their allocations, as they're called. To get really technical, it's the 302B allocations. They take their allocations and decide how to spend that, how to spread that throughout all the various programs that are under their jurisdiction. They create a bill that includes all those spending amounts, and then they send it back to the House and the Senate to pass the bills. That's the way that's sort of the basic outline of the process. Okay, go ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, so to review a couple of things, the President's budget is not the law, It's not going to become the law. It's not going to have much impact on what Congress does. Congress will ultimately decide these funding levels. And Congress relies on us, relies on you on the phone, relies on other people in your community to make good decisions. They are very welcome. They very much welcome hearing from people in their communities about how these federal programs work, about what works well and what doesn't work well, about what's important to fund and what's not important to fund. We've been very successful for a group of people that is talking about programs that serve probably the most disenfranchised and disempowered people in the country, and the people with, who has less political clout than people who are living on the street. And we've been able to convince Congress that these programs are working and they're having good impacts on the community and they should give more money. It will be important throughout to continue to make that case over and over. Next slide, please. Okay, so the general, the overall level in the Trump budget, as you can see, as I said, we're going to talk about it a little bit. Homeless assistance is cut back. We just in the 2017 bill got a healthy increase for HUD's homeless assistance programs. That increase is wiped out in the Trump budget. There are, as I said, massive cuts in a range of anti-poverty programs, including HUD's programs. Section 8, healthcare, of course, has been in the news a lot. Cuts to food stamps, cuts to TANF, a range of other kinds of programs. The VA is held pretty harmless, as are some of the smaller targeted homelessness programs, but the bigger anti-poverty programs are hit pretty hard. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next slide is for the next presentation, but let me just say we're now going to talk about 3 particular items that we are regarding as priorities. This is not because we think these programs are necessarily more important or less important or anything like that. I mean, these are priorities because they are very important to ending homelessness, and more so because we believe these are areas where advocacy by people who care about homelessness in communities can make a big difference. And we're going to start, of course, with the HUD McKinney-Vento programs. And to run through that, let me introduce Noelle Porter.
Thanks so much, Steve. As you guys probably know, the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grants Program is the federal government's largest program that specifically targets addressing homelessness in the United States. And these programs are some of the most effective and efficient at the federal level, and they have a long history of strong bipartisan support. The program consists of the Competitive Continuum of Care grants and the Formula-Based Emergency Solutions grants. Both programs fund evidence-based housing first solutions throughout state and local programs across the country, and communities all over the country rely on McKinney-Vento homeless assistance grants programs as the primary federal tool for ending homelessness. And additional funding is essential to continuing the progress that we've already made toward ending homelessness in America. Next slide, please. The Continuum of Care program under the President's proposed budget would receive at least $1.988 billion. However, this is a $295 million decrease from the amount that was provided by Congress in fiscal year 2017. And as a reminder, the funds for the COC program fund interventions including rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, supportive services, and planning. And it also supports the technical assistance to help communities improve their homeless assistance and their outcomes. The Emergency Solutions Grant would receive at least $255 million, but again, this is a $15 million decrease from the amount provided in fiscal year 2017. And the funds for this program include interventions to address emergency needs such as shelter, street outreach, essential services, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing.
And finally, the budget proposal also proposes a decrease of $5 million from 2017 for the National Homelessness Data Analysis Project, and would only receive $7 million in fiscal year 2018. Next slide, please. So the impact of this, we estimate these proposed cuts could lead to as many as 25,000 people becoming newly homeless, severely limiting your community's ability to continue the previous progress that you've already made to addressing the levels of homelessness in your communities, or to address rising needs that may result from some of the other cuts in the budget. Next slide, please. Our second major priority in advocacy and reaching out and making noise in this budget is for Medicaid. Medicaid has a 50-year history of providing health care coverage for elderly people or people with disabilities. And since the implementation of the ACA, or Obamacare as it's frequently called, many states have expanded the reach of Medicaid to serve people living in extreme poverty. And access to mainstream funding sources is one of the most effective tools to help those experiencing homelessness get the services they need to secure and maintain their stable housing, and to experience better housing outcomes as well as better health outcomes. For local communities who are combating homelessness, chronic homelessness specifically, Medicaid is very essential to pay for services. And for people with disabilities who are recovering from substance abuse disorders, living in extreme poverty, raising children, especially individuals and families who experience homelessness, Medicaid is essential for their personal coverage. Medicaid can cover emergency services, maternity and newborn care, mental health and substance use disorder services, prescription drugs, and preventative care, among many other things. Next slide, please. The administration's budget proposal will show for 2018, and this can get a little bit complicated, a small bump in the first year, about $29 million, simply to address healthcare cost inflation and operating in Medicaid budgets. However, the proposal directs future cuts to begin in fiscal year 2020 by changing the structure of Medicaid payments. So the budget would reform future Medicaid spending from a fundamental structure, which was federal matching based on the actual health care costs in states, to a per capita cap or a block grant structure. This reform would reduce Medicaid spending by $616 billion over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. It's important to note that these reductions in the President's budget are intended to be made in addition to the cuts included in any final health care reform bill. The American Health Care Act was passed in the House earlier this month and has a proposed reduction of Medicaid spending by at least an additional $800 billion over the next 10 years. These reforms together effectively would reduce Medicaid spending by anywhere from 47 to 50% by 2027, or cut Medicaid spending in half in the next 10 years. The impact of these estimates is that at least 14 million Americans will be jeopardized immediately. Their coverage could be cut or could be severely drawn back due to the cuts included in the AHCA or the American Health Care Act alone. Combined with the changes in the budget proposal, this will strip away crucial resources from communities, hindering efforts to get people with disabilities, substance use disorders, and those in poverty the care and services that they need to maintain stable housing. And now Steve's going to tell you about the third priority in our budget, advocacy.
Okay, the third priority is the broader issue of affordable housing. And this is something people know. There's been a lot of recent talk about it. Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, I think set off a whole national conversation about how people with the lowest incomes in the United States get housed. And this is, of course, the underlying reason that we have homelessness to deal with, is because housing is not affordable. The President's budget downsizes the Section 8 or the Housing Choice Voucher Program by approximately 250,000 households, so a 12.5% reduction in the number of people housed through the Section 8 program. Our thought is that this is more than housing authorities will be able to handle through attrition. So this means for the first time in maybe ever, the first time ever, yes, it is the first time ever, that existing voucher holders will have their vouchers canceled out from under them. We have, so that's the first piece we're looking at. The President's budget would eliminate the National Housing Trust Fund, which finally, after many years of advocacy, has now gotten to the points where states are actually receiving money from that to develop low-income housing. And then the President's budget also makes severe cuts to public housing, which cuts at the level where it's impossible to imagine that the nation's housing authorities can absorb that level of cuts without units going offline. They won't have the money to keep units up. They'll have to, as they deteriorate, they'll have to shut them down, which means, well, one of the things we've learned from research in a number of communities is that people who lose public housing are among the most at risk of becoming homeless upon losing their public housing. So this will have a huge effect on homelessness programs. Next slide, please. So what we need is these resources to be maintained and expanded. The Housing Choice Voucher Program needs to be funded at a level that will retain its existing capacity. This is something that there has been a great deal of support for in Congress, bipartisan support over many years, and we believe this is doable, and we believe it will be very helpful to that conversation for people who work on homelessness to tell their members of Congress how the voucher program impacts homelessness in the community, how it helps. The same with the National Housing Trust Fund. The law that's in existence right now works just fine. It's already began to generate money. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are the two big sort of quasi-public corporations that help support home ownership in the country, and their profits, a certain percentage of those are funneled into the National Housing Trust Fund. That needs to continue. And then public housing, again, needs to be funded at a level that will at least preserve existing capacity so that we don't have public housing units going offline and the people who are living there becoming homeless in communities. So those are our three priorities. There are many, many, many other important issues to talk about related to federal funding and federal programs. Many of those are covered in the materials that Julie talked about at the start of the broadcast, and that you can find on our website and will be available throughout the year. So we also encourage people to be in touch with us if there's other federal programs that you're interested in and want to work on, and we can help figure out how to have the biggest possible impact. On the Alliance is going to be leading the charge on McKinney-Vento, HUD McKinney-Vento funding, as we always do. The next thing on the webinar is going to be hearing from Julie about how to get involved in that. And she'll also talk about some other opportunities, on both Medicaid and on the big housing issues. The Alliance is working in coalition with many, many other groups who are much more expert than we are even about these programs. These groups are very welcoming to us and to you because they believe that the discussion about how Medicaid impacts homelessness, how housing vouchers and the trust fund and public housing and the larger housing resources impact homelessness. They're very happy to have that be part of the conversation. And we can give you some suggestions for who to follow, whose websites, who's to get involved with in order to be active on that. So let me now turn over to Julie about what we're going to do moving forward to get Congress to make a budget that helps us.
Thanks so much, Steve. And thanks, Steve and Noel, for that great rundown of our what's in the budget around our priorities. To transition now into advocacy efforts, I want to start off by just giving a bit of a background for those on the webinar new to advocacy before delving into the specifics of what we're going to be doing this year. So for some context, advocacy, it can be defined as the active support of an idea or cause, and it can take a broad array of forms. Advocacy efforts can range from generally educating a decision maker on an important issue to lobbying directly about a specific piece of legislation that you're asking the policymaker to take specific action on. Advocacy efforts can be directed towards decision makers at the federal, state, and local levels of government, and the Alliance focuses on federal advocacy work, but it's also very important to advocate at the state and local level and to engage state and local leaders you build relationships with in that advocacy and your federal advocacy work, and we'll be getting back to that later. All right, next slide, please. So why is it important for homeless advocates to engage in federal advocacy work? Homeless assistance programs in local communities across the country rely on federal funding to operate and serve and house people experiencing homelessness in their communities. It is critically important that federal funding programs receive adequate funding to enable communities to quickly respond to people's housing crises and then connect people with permanent housing in order to make progress in ending homelessness. Funding levels for federal programs, including the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grants Program, greatly impact homeless service providers' capacities to do their job. Next slide, please. And then another reason that it's important to engage in federal advocacy is that members of Congress rely on their constituents for information about issues that are impacting people in the states or districts they represent. They have a wide variety of issues constantly vying for their attention. And if no one tells members about the problem of homelessness in their communities and what they should do to address it, they may never realize they need to do anything about it. People involved in the homeless assistance field, many of you on the call, see the challenges homelessness presents for people in your communities on a daily basis and have a good sense of the nature and extent of the problem locally. You are the experts on this issue, and it is up to you to educate your members of Congress about the issue and ask them to do specific things in response to the situation. This is especially important because people experiencing homelessness are, of course, among the most vulnerable and powerless members of our society, and it's important that advocates give people in this situation a voice by sharing their challenges and advocating to change their circumstances. But with that said, I also want to emphasize here that it is really important to, whenever possible, include people who have lived experience of homelessness themselves in your advocacy efforts. All right, next slide, please. So how can you start or continue taking action right now? That's what you all want to hear about. As you heard, the 3 priority issues the Alliance will focus on in response to this year's budget are increasing funding for HUD's McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Grants Program, ensuring people at risk of and experiencing homelessness have access to Medicaid, and protecting and increasing funding for affordable housing programs that prevent people from becoming homeless. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about how we will begin responding to the budget through our advocacy work to achieve these goals in FY 2018. So for number 1 priority, McKinney-Vento, the first thing that we're going to be asking you each to do, ideally, you know, right after this call or tomorrow, since this ends at 5 o'clock, is call or email your members of Congress and thank them for providing a $133 million increase to the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Program in the recently passed FY 2017 bill. And thank them, share the effective work that McKinney is allowing you to do to end homelessness in your community. Share how permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and other programs are really helping you to make progress and how that increase is going to help increase your capacity, and thank them. After that, make sure to remind them how important it is to provide another increase for this program in FY 2018 to help your community continue making progress on ending homelessness. Let them know that the Trump administration's budget proposals cut is unacceptable and how cuts to McKinney would hurt your community, any cuts. Finally, ask them to instead support at least the $217 million increase to $2.6 billion for McKinney in FY 2018. Let them know that with this increase, we could house approximately 40,000 more people nationally, and how increased funds would allow your community to continue progress. All right, so how are you going to do that? We've made it easy for you. You can just copy and paste the link on the webinar screen at the bottom of the slide, which will take you to our Take Action page where we have editable call and email templates with this message. And after editing those, you can submit them through our website to your congressional offices. So make sure after this call or tomorrow we'll be sending out the slides to check out that link and go and email or use the prompts through our website to call your members of Congress and make sure get a timely thank you in and also a timely response to the President's proposal and request for not only an avoidance of cuts but an increase in funds to continue progress. All right, so that's the first thing. All right. The next thing is a little bit more complicated, but we know you're up to the task. So the next thing we're asking you to do is to mobilize your community around advocating to Congress about the need to end homelessness. We think that in the current Congress and the administration, it is going to be critically important that in addition to hearing from people who work in the homeless services field about the need to end homelessness, Congress hears from other prominent stakeholders in your community about this as well. It's going to be important for you to work to engage a diverse array of leaders in this work. As such, I'd like everyone on this webinar to take a moment right now, and as I keep talking, to think about who they have relationships with or connections to who support the goal of ending homelessness in your community. Are these leaders being vocal to Congress about this issue? Could they be more vocal? Think about local and state elected officials such as mayors, city council members, your governor. Think about other public officials, agency department heads, police, schools. Think about private sector partners, corporations, local chambers of commerce, et cetera. And think about faith-based partners that you may have. Keep thinking through this, and as you're listening to this webinar and after, begin making a list of who you have relationships with or possible connections to, and others who might be worth introducing yourself to, who you could reach out to educate about the great work you're doing to end homelessness in your community, and ask these prominent leaders to get involved. All right, next slide. So with that context, the next step the Alliance is asking everyone on this webinar to take is to reach out to such prominent and diverse stakeholders in your community and ask them to sign on to a letter addressed to the members of your congressional delegation expressing concern about the issue of homelessness in your community and emphasizing the need for Congress to increase funding for this program to address it. So to give you a starting point for getting these local leaders to sign on to a letter, we've drafted a template letter for you to go in and edit, and you can find this letter on our advocacy page in the Take Action section. So be sure, again, to check that out. It's also where the call-in scripts are. So download this letter from our Take Action page and edit it to make it specific to your community's experience with homelessness. There are kind of instructions about what we recommend you add, but you, of course, should take the liberty to add anything that you think Congress should know about what your community is experiencing with this issue and how you're addressing it. Once you have it edited and you feel it is in a good shape, feel free to get our input and then reach out to community leaders to ask for sign-ons to this letter. You can also ask colleagues and partners, as I mentioned before, who might have connections that you don't, to help you out with asking leaders for sign-ons. And then once you're confident that your letter demonstrates a strong showing of support, you have enough sign-ons for ending homelessness from community stakeholders, we're asking you to email it to your congressional offices. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the Alliance for help getting contact information for both the member's office email as well as the housing staff person. And then once you have sent your letters, please let us know. We want to make sure that we know of all the letters that have been sent so we can use that in our advocacy work going forward. And then this is important. If you're planning on attending our July conference and participating in Capitol Hill Day on July 19th, which we hope you all will this year, as this is very important, we ask that you aim to complete these letters before then. That way you can bring them to our Capitol Hill Day and include them in the packets for your meetings with congressional staff. And if we have many of these letters, it's going to really amplify the effect of our Hill Day, because it's not just going to be you who are coming to speak about homelessness, but it will be clear that you're speaking really on behalf of your broader communities. All right, and if you have any questions, again, while preparing your letters, don't hesitate to let us know. We're here, as always, as a resource for you. So Before heading into the next priority, I do want to take a moment to just kind of re-emphasize and explain why, kind of tell you why we really need you to do this right now, why demonstrating this broad community support for ending homelessness is so timely and critical. So the budget, of course, as you heard, would cut McKinney-Vento homeless assistance, limiting your system's capacities to the extent that approximately 25,000 more people will become homeless due to this cut alone. This is unacceptable, and not only do we need to defend against cuts, but as Steve mentioned, work to increase, and Noel mentioned, our capacity to end homelessness. This is especially important considering cuts to other key housing, social service, and safety net programs are at risk for cuts or elimination that would make it more difficult for poor and low-income people to keep a roof over their head. And then, as Steve mentioned, though this budget proposal is expected to be dead upon arrival in Congress, the budget's priorities and administration's talking points around the budget really raise the question of the government's role in helping poor and low-income people. We need to make it clear that people experiencing or at risk of homelessness need the federal government's help, and that it's the government's responsibility to lead the response to homelessness. This work is particularly core to HUD's mission to create quality, affordable housing for all, and HUD's work to provide information from around the country and analyze what practices are effective and share and incentivize those has been critical to national progress on ending homelessness. We also need to make sure Congress and the administration hear loud and clear that although the state and local government, private sector, philanthropy, and faith-based partners and others have key roles in leveraging federal funds to end homelessness, there's not nearly enough state, local, or private funding to fill the gaps that would be left by large federal cuts. This is really important, and the sign-on letter includes language to this effect, and it will be much more powerful to say this in the letters if these stakeholders have signed on to the letters. All right, and then as was explained earlier, just to reiterate, we really need to make sure that Congress and the administration repeatedly hear this year from your communities how efficient and effective homeless assistance programs are. These are increasingly important criteria that federal programs are being evaluated by in this tough budget and fiscally conservative environment, and there's room in the letter for you to share the impacts of McKinney-funded rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing programs in your community. There's also room in the letter for you to explain how federal funds are being leveraged with local dollars in your community through housing funds from local donors or local taxes or bonds, and that many local investments would not be made without the initial federal investment, which helps to demonstrate that the federal investment is a smart one. And then we need to keep repeating these points in our advocacy through the year and remind Congress and the administration that continued investment is needed, not only because it's the right and smart thing to do, but because they will also be held accountable. There have been decreases in the number of people experiencing homelessness in our country since the annual point-in-time counts began, despite many national headwinds. And if the numbers of people experiencing homelessness go up, it will be very clear who is responsible. All right, so that was a lot on McKinney, and I think I'm going over my time, so I am going to go a bit more quickly through. Next slide, please. All right, so for Medicaid, as you heard from Noel, this is our second priority for the year, and there is a current ask around this action you can take. Families USA has a letter where you can ask your senators to reject the House-passed American Health Care Act that would repeal the ACA and strip 24 million people of health coverage, gut consumer protections, and shred the Medicaid safety net. So we need to ensure people experiencing homelessness have access to critical health care and supportive services funded by Medicaid, and we encourage you to check out that link on your screen and go send that letter to your senators. And then next slide, please. There are also 2 opportunities to take actions around affordable housing. The first is that the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding that the Alliance is very active in has a organizational sign-on letter right now out asking members of Congress to lift the spending caps. These are the caps required by the Budget Control Act that Steve described earlier, and fund the T-HUD bill to ensure affordable housing, community development, and transportation programs receive the highest allocation of discretionary funds possible. And then the second opportunity on your screen there is, as you heard, the budget proposed to cut the National Housing Trust Fund. So there is also a letter out that is another organizational sign-on letter that urges Congress to protect and expand the National Housing Trust Fund. So please also go ahead and fill that out as well. All right. So I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. So I would just like to, next slide please, briefly say that we hope that you will, after calling your members of Congress, emailing them through our site, getting started on the community sign-on letters, really reaching out to leaders you haven't engaged in your federal advocacy work before, because we really need to take this up to the next level this year and try and get those community sign-on letters ready for Hill Day. After that, we hope you come to our Hill Day. It's going to be a really exciting event this year. We're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the McKinney-Vento Act. So please stay for Hill Day. Please schedule your travel around being there for the whole afternoon. And then after Hill Day, we really hope that you will continue to be involved in our advocacy this year and sustain your advocacy efforts through local engagement during the August recess and beyond, through site visits of your homeless assistance programs, in-district meetings, raising the issue of homelessness at town halls, and continuing to receive our advocacy alerts and respond to them. And if you are not yet on our advocacy alert list, we strongly encourage you to sign up. You'll be receiving a survey after this webinar with a few questions about your advocacy experience and willingness to engage going forward, and also asking you about your willingness to commit to reach out to local leaders, and you'll also have an opportunity in that survey to sign up for our alerts. So we really look forward to continuing or beginning to work with you this year if you're new, and with that, I am going to hand this over to my colleague Jared Thompson, who has been very helpful in organizing this webinar and going through the questions you're all sending to facilitate a brief Q&A session.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. So we do have a few questions and we've got some time. So first thing I want to address, we have gotten a few questions about our estimate for how many people are going to be affected by the McKinney-Vento cuts. Just to clarify, we are estimating that would result in 25,000 people becoming newly homeless, not 125,000. We'll fix that on the slide before we post them online, and those will be available after the webinar today. So on to our questions. The first one we've got is related to tax reform. Steve, would you be willing to talk a little bit about what our advocacy stance is in regards to tax reform and Section 8 housing versus the mortgage interest rate deduction?
Sure. Yeah. As people may know, some of the subsidies for housing in the U.S. are done through the tax system. The largest is, of course, the mortgage interest deduction, which largely accrues to higher income people. And there's been a movement led by the National Low Income Housing Coalition and others in recent years to, whenever Congress takes up tax reform, to take a look at that and change the way that's done. One, to make the mortgage interest deduction a better tool for first-time home ownership, but also to take some of that money and shift it over to rentals for low-income people. We are 100% supportive of that. If Congress takes up tax reform this year, we'll be working with others to try to make that happen. And on the other side, there's dangers in that too, because the low-income housing tax credit program is also done through the tax system. That's been a real driver for development of low-income housing in many communities, and that may be at risk, as might any other thing. I mean, there's no specific proposals for tax reform out that Congress is likely to move on, so it's hard to say what exactly that will entail. But if that starts to happen, we'll definitely make that part of what we're working on. Jared, do you want to go? Do you have other questions?
Yes, sorry, I was still on mute. Thanks for that. The next question we've got, the budget proposal does suggest ending or sunsetting the Interagency Council on Homelessness, and we've got a listener wondering what our thoughts are on that and what our stance is going to be going forward.
Sure, yeah. People who've known us for a while know that the Alliance has been a long time very active supporter of having a U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and having it be as effective as possible. The 2017 bill that just passed went ahead and provided them funding and extended their sunset. As people know, the statute that set up the law that set up the Interagency Council has a hard sunset date, and that keeps getting pushed back. We will be trying to do the same thing in the 2018 bill.
Great, thank you. The next one we've got is related to faith-based organizations. Wondering what kind of federal support and federal funding many faith-based organizations receive, and how we can bring them into our advocacy efforts a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that different kinds of faith-based organizations definitely participate in these programs that we've been talking about. A great deal of the funding from the HUD McKinney programs goes to different faith-based organizations. There are an even larger number of faith-based organizations who are involved in the issue of homelessness at the local level. Even if for whatever reason they don't want to take federal funds, they're providing important services and have been very active in advocacy efforts. I mean, even a group that doesn't necessarily get federal money can still be a very valuable advocate because they care about homelessness in their community. And so we encourage people to get those groups as involved as they possibly can.
And Julie, this is Julie, for just one extra note, I think often continuums of care have a faith-based representative on the COC board. So if you're thinking of a place to start, you don't have a lot of connections to the faith community, that could be one thing to, one person to reach out to as your starting point.
Great, thank you so much. One more is related to infrastructure spending, and wondering if this budget has given any insight to the administration's claim that public housing improvements are going to be included in separate infrastructure spending.
I think this budget has some infrastructure spending in it, but not the kind of thing you're talking about. And I think everybody expects, I think people believe that when the administration is talking about an infrastructure bill, they're looking at something else than what's in its budget request. But that's something to keep a careful eye on, because I think exactly what you said, whoever asked the question, the administration has said housing will be a part of infrastructure, and has also said, well, the cuts will be made up for, in some cases, by infrastructure spending, but we haven't seen a specific proposal.
Great, thank you so much. And just to wrap it up, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we are getting close. With so many programs having proposed cuts that impact homelessness and or touch the service providers that work in this realm, what is the most impactful thing that advocates can do right away to help their programs?
Well, again, this is Steve again, and I can wrap this up. I mean, what we try to do with the Alliance is answer that question for people who want to end homelessness. So I would say, again, work with other people in your community who care about these issues. Start by reaching out to members of Congress right now, saying thank you for the increase in homeless assistance in 2017. Be very clear that we need additional increases. We still have people who are homeless. We have people living in shelters, living on the streets. We know exactly what to do for them. The programs are very effective and efficient at ending as much homelessness as they can with the amount of money involved, and we need to up the spending to have those impacts. Make those calls yourself. Get other people in your community to make the calls. Be in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter. Go to the advocacy section on our website. Sign up for our news alerts. We'll keep you informed of when the opportunities are to make a difference. But I have found for a number of years now that the group of people who take part in these advocacy efforts are among the most effective advocates there are, and that's a good thing because the people we're serving need that. And I'm very confident that we will continue to be able to have that kind of impact. Thanks to all of you.
Okay, great. Well, that is all the time we have today. As I mentioned, we will be making these slides available on our website after the webinar is over. We also have a couple other web resources up there, including a chart that breaks down some of the most important programs and a rundown of all of our important programs and what's in the budget. So if you want to find out more about what is in the budget, check out our website, and if you want to find out how to get involved, we've got a bunch of information there as well. Thank you all.